Okay, so for this class, I want to pick up the discussion of the Constitution that we had last class. I believe this is about where I left off, talking about the idea that the Constitution is not a particularly democratic constitution, right? It actually has lots of institutions that actually inhibit the power of the majority of people. It is meant to diminish the democratic will of the majority. And there are various reasons for that. I brought up the idea last class that this more or less reflects the economic interests of the founders, who were property owners, although of different types within the North and South. And they wanted to make sure that the interest of the, property owning minority of Americans would prevail over the majority, most of whom did not own property, or at least not significant amounts of property. Now, turning this to the present day, I think is important as well, because I think it speaks to a lot of the difficulties, particularly within the Democratic Party, to get anything done. And I think this is a very important debate that needs to be had. We do have an election coming up, but I also have noticed a tendency among a lot of people. I've heard it from students, I've heard it from professors, I've heard it from people in the media. A lot of people think that Biden is doing a really good job. And I got to say, I'm a bit surprised by that when people say that. And I think maybe it's not necessarily his fault or the fault of the Democratic Party. I think it relates to the very strong restrictions upon getting things passed that would be in the interest of the majority of people. This is obviously not something just limited to the Biden administration, of course, obviously, but something that you see very much within the Obama administration, within the Clinton administration as well, going back into the 1990s, all post-Ronald Reagan Democratic administrations especially, but of course, throughout all of American history, you can see this, tendency really sort of play itself out. So let's, take a moment here and really sort of run down Biden's record real quickly. Obviously, just give a sort of overview of things. First of all, a lot of Americans do not seem to really approve of what Biden is doing. Depending on how much influence or how much weight you give to public opinion. But according to polls, this is according to the website Axios, well, you can find it elsewhere as well. 2 out of 3 Americans basically think that the country is on the wrong track. This is from recent polling from just about a month ago or so. So this is pretty up to date. 2 out of 3 Americans, 66% of Americans basically think the country is not going in a good direction. The approval rating of the president is only about 40%, not particularly high. Anything below 40% is generally considered to be a low approval rating. So obviously, if I'm critical of the Biden administration, if I'm critical of the Democratic Party, I'm certainly not the only one. It seems like the vast majority of Americans feel that way. Now, you could argue that they could be wrong, that their negative opinions are themselves faulty or mistaken or something like that, or that these polls don't reflect the true public opinion. You could always make any kind of argument like that. There are, of course, other things besides just that, right? You have seen, I'm sure everyone's aware of, several highly publicized strikes that have been going on in various industries. The one big one going on right now, of course, is the actors and writers who are on strike. But preceding this, and really for several years now, teachers have gone on strike, both at the primary school level, but also college and graduate student instructors have gone on strike. I used to teach at Rutgers. I participated in the strike that was there recently. Actually, I kind of got laid off after that strike was resolved, because that's kind of what happens in this country. People, some adjuncts got a raise, but a lot of other people got laid off because, you don't have any real job security there. But again, all these things are going on. Why would so many people be taking to the streets, protesting, going on strike? Going on strike is a big deal. It's not something that you can really take lightly. And of course, this is not something that you see just within the United States. I mean, you see this within other countries as well. You see this within the United Kingdom. You see massive protests going on in France and in other places as well. So clearly, there are a lot of people out there who have a strong sense that things are not going well. And where does this come from? It seems to be a bit, paternalistic and condescending after a while, to constantly be like lecturing these people that somehow their views are not valid, or that they're mistaken to be, upset at things. Especially when you're constantly magnifying the amount of people. I mean, we're talking probably like tens of millions of people at the least. If you look at it in a larger perspective, like I said, just outside this country, I mean, it could be even significantly more than that. People have tried to, excuse Biden's performance in various ways. One of the arguments I hear often is the idea that the Democrats performed better than expected in the 2022 midterm elections. I mean, they lost. they lost control of the House of Representatives, but because they did not lose by a larger majority, that is somehow interpreted to be a good performance, even though they basically lost control of the House. In fact, this is often said by campaign people close to Biden, who often are dismissive of these very negative polls. Now, all right, so let's get into more the substance of what has Biden actually done while he is president. There are other things that you could point to. I would say probably the two biggest things, certainly in terms of what the campaign seems to be focusing on, what they at least feel to be are the greatest achievements, are the bipartisan infrastructure deal and the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, you can go into the particulars more of what these things entail. I'm going to assume that people have at least some knowledge of that already, and if they don't, it's very easy to sort of look up at least the bullet points of what these things do. Obviously, infrastructure is about modernizing the bridges and railways and tunnels and things like that. Oh, I forgot to mention a moment ago, one of the highly publicized strikes did not actually happen, right? Because the railroad workers were actually blocked from going on strike by the president, and basically had a contract that they had rejected by over 90%, forcibly imposed upon them, against their will. And that was the only way that they were able to avoid that strike from happening. They just barely avoided. It looks like the dock workers going on strike, and now there's lots of talk, of course, about the UPS workers going out on strike also. So strike is in the air. Again, there's a lot of emphasis on this right now, which again I would think would seriously undermine the credibility of claims when people say that Biden is doing a job. If Biden is doing such a great job, why are so many workers going out on strike? Even if compared to the peak of the labor movement, from the 1930s through the 1970s, I think the numbers of people may be lower. I think that is true, but that's also a reflection of the fact that organized labor in this country is also much weaker than it was during that peak period of time. But certainly since about 2018 or so, there's been a pretty significant increase in the number of workers going out on strike. So how do you account for all that and then still want to maintain the claim that the president is doing a good job? Anyway, so the infrastructure bill passed. However, it was originally supposed to be part of a bigger kind of social infrastructure bill, which would actually spend money on people within this country, do things to actually improve people's living standards. That did not pass. And it did not pass because it was blocked by the Republicans, as well as by conservative Democrats as well. You can't blame it only on the Republican Party. The Inflation Reduction Act has been seriously compromised by the recent debt ceiling bill, which also, to make matters worse, actually had more Democrats voting for that than the Republicans, because the Republicans wanted an even more extreme debt ceiling bill. So Biden's two significant accomplishments, the ones that they pay the most attention to, I would say are significantly undermined. And I have a hard time, accepting that idea that they are really the great achievements that they are made to be. What people want to elevate Biden to be the next FDR. He's the most pro-union president in history. I mean, again, that's ironic, being that one of his, big things that he's done is essentially, block workers from going out on strike. And again, like I said, basically forcing a contract on them against their will. As far as Biden being the next FDR, I mean, FDR had a much more favorable political climate to operate in. Biden, and this is what I mean about, especially post-Reagan Democratic presidents, have been severely constrained in what they are able to do, in a way that FDR, for example, is not. Not that FDR was able to get everything he wanted either, but certainly had much more leeway to operate than recent Democratic presidents do. Besides these things, besides these signature achievements, which I would say have been severely compromised, other proposals like raising the minimum wage, getting paid family leave, which I did not include here, forgiving a small portion of student loan debt, and expanding the child tax credit have all been blocked. So it wasn't able to get any of it. You can't brag about those things if you weren't actually able to get those things, through. The president has also, I would say, very controversially claimed that the pandemic is over. This has recently been echoed in a recent New York Times article by David Leonhardt, which points to the fact that the excess level of deaths, or the excess number of deaths, are back to 2019 levels. The implication being that means that, COVID is basically over. It's become just a normal illness, which is what people have been saying for quite a long time. There's no mention, by the way, of long COVID in that article, which I think is concerning, because long COVID may not kill people, but it does severely disable people. There's no acknowledgement of that in the article. And there are plenty of health experts that do not share this view. One person, Arjit Chakravarti, recently stated that the virus has not got the memo, referring to claims that the pandemic is over. He believes, and many other people believe, that this thing is still out there. It is certainly a pandemic, of course, is a global phenomenon. If you look at excess deaths outside of the United States, they're still quite high. But another reason to object this is something I found here. Blake Murdoch, who's explicitly referring to this article, says that the claim, the conclusion drawn from the claim that the pandemic is over because the excess number of deaths is back to 2019 levels, he says is false. He says if the pandemic was truly over, excess deaths would run significantly below historical averages for quite a while, reflecting all the people who didn't die because they already died prematurely of COVID. Many people are still dying. In other words, this is what is referred to as the compensation effect. If the excess number of deaths is more people were dying on average for several years at a higher than average number, to sort of balance things out, the excess number of deaths should be below the average number. The fact that it's just gone back down to the 2019 level then would suggest that, as he says here, that a lot of people are basically still dying of COVID. That in fact, if the pandemic was over, that the average number of deaths should actually be below the average number to sort of balance out for the higher than average number of deaths, which we've seen for the last several years. Now, of course, I don't expect anybody to, just take at face value something that person says on Twitter. So what are this guy's qualifications? It says he's a JD MBA, not an MD. JD means he's a lawyer. MBA means he has a master's of business administration. It says he is a health law scholar, bioethicist, and science communicator, senior research associate, Health Law Institute, the University of Alberta. So it sounds like he has some kind of qualifications, not necessarily, he's not a doctor as far as I can tell. Now, Chakravarti is a doctor and also the CEO of a medical research company, which has been pretty accurate at predicting the paths in which the pandemic was going to go. There are many other people who do have MDs, who are doctors, who are also very much concerned about these things. So I would say, in short, that claims that the pandemic is over, I think, are still a little premature. And this is not the first time that frankly the government and people in the media have prematurely declared the pandemic to be over. I mean, by my count, they've done this at least 3 or 4 times already. Really going back to 2021, maybe, or even before then. I mean, by the end of 2020, I mean, they were already trying to, push people back into work and open up all the schools and everything. That's pre-Delta, that's pre Omicron. That's, I mean, obviously there were a lot of twists and turns that this pandemic had still yet to take. By the time people were already trying to proclaim that the pandemic was over. And of course, yes, there are other doctors who have other opinions. I can't say I have the final word on this either. I just know that there are a lot of people who seem to have some qualification, some expertise on this issue that are still significantly concerned and seem to make a pretty good argument for it. Other doctors, who knows what their agenda could be. I mean, many of them are tied to pharmaceutical companies, many of them are tied to the government. I'm not necessarily sure what the agenda would be for people to want to falsely extend the pandemic or to falsely, proclaim that the pandemic is still a threat when it was over. I don't really see what they would get out of that. So anyway, running through all this, despite the best of intentions, and that's, I think a fairly charitable framing of the Democratic Party, it does not seem that the Democrats can get very much done. Now, as this relates back to the Constitution, I mean, isn't that kind of the point, though? I mean, going back to what we were talking about last class, is that the Constitution is too undemocratic, that it makes it too hard to get things done, to get things passed into law that would actually benefit people. So if we can criticize the Biden administration and the Obama administration and the Clinton administration and acknowledge that, yes, it may not entirely be their fault that they're not able to get everything done that they want to get done. There may be forces outside of their control that they cannot, overcome. On the other hand, though, how long are people supposed to just sort of sit back and just kind of take this? I mean, these are, of course, important things. I don't really like this kind of all shucks attitude that a lot of people have. In other words, like, oh shucks, we didn't get what we wanted. Oh well, better luck next time. I mean, for some people, they're not, there's not going to be a next time. Not to be overly dramatic here, but I mean, these are, very important life or death issues for a lot of people. And there are obviously many other things I could point out as well: the lack of healthcare in this country and things like that. People who are going bankrupt, trying to pay for their cancer treatments. People who have lost family and friends because of drug overdose deaths, because of COVID. People who are facing significant problems, economic and otherwise. Don't have the luxury to just sit back and wait for things to get better and just be like, oh well, we'll try to do better next time. Anyway, I mean, given the way the political system is structured in this country, there's not even really that much of a guarantee that things will get better next time. I mean, this is pretty much, again, the system is permanently set up in a way to make it extremely hard, to get things passed. And again, I say, like, how long do elites in this country expect people to just sort of sit around and wait for that to happen? AOC caught a lot of flack for saying the people who did not support Biden were privileged. And I think the reason that she got a lot of negative feedback for that, one, she's supposed to be a socialist, and any, I would say, authentic socialist would be extremely critical of the Biden administration. But two, I mean, what she says kind of seems to, turn logic on its head. It seems to be sort of inverting logic, which is that it's actually the privileged people in this country that do have the luxury to just vote for Biden or vote blue no matter who. And whether they win or lose, even if they win, if they don't get much stuff done, it's not going to really impact them that much anyway. They're part of the affluent middle class. If Biden doesn't really get very much done, it's not going to really affect them that much anyway. That, to me, seems to be the privileged people. The people who are not privileged are the people, like I said, who are going broke, trying to pay for their medical care and things like that, or are delaying starting a family because they can't get out of debt and things like that, and can't afford to buy a home and things like that. Those are the people that don't seem to be privileged, who are desperately waiting, for something to happen. In my experience, again, most of the people who are the vote blue no matter who, and are saying, Biden's doing a great job and things like that, almost without exception are more affluent people, whether they're professors who have tenure and probably have a pretty good standard of living, people in the media, celebrities, other people I've encountered. I mean, almost without exception. they tend to be, generally, better, more well-off people. So I would say, that comment is completely upside down as far as who's privileged and how that privilege sort of influences their voting behavior and what candidates that they support. And again, I'm not introducing this here just to run down Biden. I'm trying to relate this to the Constitution with the very explicit focus on the fact that this is kind of what the Constitution is set up to do. And again, yes, it may not necessarily be entirely Biden's fault, or like it was not entirely Obama's fault that he really didn't get much done either. But being that may be true, again, how long do you expect people to just sit around and wait for things to change? So, unless of course you don't think that things are really that bad. But again, I would say that pretty much shows a certain class perspective here. So, with that being said, again, returning to the idea that the Constitution is not a particularly democratic document, or does not, outline a system of government that is particularly democratic. Let's now talk about a little bit of it, right? Because in any, of course, American politics class like this, you have to kind of run through, the overview of the institutions and how they work. So let's start with the Congress. And we will, later on in the class, return to each of the three branches of government and talk about them a little more in depth. So right now, I'll just kind of give a brief overview. So the Congress, of course, is made up of the House of Representatives and the Senate. The House of Representatives has 435 voting members. It is obviously much larger than the Senate. It is chosen based on the population of the states. States that have a greater population have more representatives than states that are smaller. Now, that is a democratic thing. That is probably the most democratic branch of government within the federal government. But that has significant problems. Again, when we talk about Congress more later on in the semester, we'll talk about issues like gerrymandering, for example, which significantly undermine even the branch of government which is supposed to be the most democratic. The Senate, on the other hand, is made up of 100 members, 2 from each state, and it is a much less democratic branch of government. It gives equal representation to the small states as well as to the larger states. So what that does is that it, again, undermines the power of a popular majority of people. You could have states where relatively few people live be able to essentially block things from happening that people who live in larger states want to happen. And again, as I just went through the Biden administration's record, I mean, and there's so many other things I could talk about. Again, support for healthcare, support for kind of, Medicare for all type of system, taking significant action on climate change. I mean, there's so many more things that I could talk about that are not being answered, or that there's no real response or significant response or effective response from the government. They may do something or claim to do something, but are these things really having an effective impact? I would say in most cases, no. So anyway, so that's more or less how the Congress is set up. You have the 2 branches, the House and the Senate. Now, obviously, to get a law passed, a bill has to go through both the House and Senate, voted on separately, voted on in identical form. Oftentimes, what you have happen is that the House or the Senate might pass a bill, and then the other branch might pass a similar, but not the identical bill. That does not work. And then, of course, when you do have an identical bill, then it, of course, gets sent up to the president to be signed into law. But it has to be identical. If it is not, they have to re-vote on it, basically. They have to work out the discrepancies between each bill and get it into identical form. And if you can't, then it just doesn't become a law. And that happens plenty of times, too. I mean, and then, of course, there's the process of going through committees. And again, I'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk a little bit more about Congress in depth later on in the semester. But before things can even be voted on, in most cases, be voted on by the entire House or by the entire Senate, it goes through different specialized committees within the House and Senate, who basically, like I say, focus on specific aspects of legislation and sort of draft up the language that will, eventually become the bill. Many times, though, things never even make it out of committee, and there are lots of techniques and tactics that go into that, where things get sort of buried down in the agenda, so that by the time the legislative session ends, there is sort of a time limit for the amount of time in which Congress will deliberate over things, debate, and argue over things, and craft legislation. That if that time limit expires, they may not even get around to hearing certain things, and that happens a lot. Anyway, though, I have this map up because I want to show a little bit more about how things in the House work, right? Because 2 senators from each state, I think that's pretty easy to understand for the most part. And of course, like I said, later on, we'll talk more about the filibuster in the Senate as well. But how do the selection of representatives from the states work? Well, again, it is based on population. But what happens when the population changes or shifts, as is pretty much constantly happening within the country? So this is an older map from about 10 years ago. This is the more up-to-date map. And again, as you can see, there are differences here. And thankfully, these things are kind of color-coded to sort of let you know which states are increasing the number of representatives and which states are losing and which states are not changing, as many of them are not. But that's basically what happens. So, every 10 years or so, when they do the census and they determine the population levels of the country, of course, these are all estimates, but to the best of their ability, that impacts the distribution of representatives throughout the states. So if you live in a state that is losing people, if people are moving out of that state, that will eventually impact things, that the state will lose representatives. So you can see states like New York and Pennsylvania, and pretty much a good portion of what makes up the so-called Midwest, or what is not so affectionately referred to as the Rust Belt of the country, have all lost significant numbers of people living within these states. At one point, go back 100 years or so, most of the population of the country was concentrated here, and this has, for a long time now, been a process where people have been moving out of these states. You can see, for the most part, the great beneficiaries of it have been Texas, Florida, some states out on the Southwest, the Northwest have generally benefited more from this. California, obviously, as you can see here, has 53 representatives. That means that it is the largest state by population. It has the most number of representatives. Second is Texas. Third and fourth, actually, here are New York and Florida, which are tied. But let's go to the more up-to-date map. So you can see that even a decade ago, people have been leaving some of these states that I just mentioned. As of the most recent census, this process has continued. Even California, as you can see, lost one. But New York lost another one. It used to be at 27. Now it's 26. So now Florida actually has more people, or more representatives, which would indicate more people living within that state. So it is now the third largest state in the country. It's ironic because, if you often hear about people, moving out of this area to Florida. So it's fun to imagine that the people leaving New York are probably moving to Florida. That very well could be the case, based on lots of examples of people I know of. And actually, for the most part, I mean, if you see the states that are actually gaining representatives, rather, these are basically states that I've all heard of, people moving to North Carolina, moving to Florida, moving even to Colorado. Although I don't know anybody that's moved to Montana. I don't know anyone that's moved to Texas either, but apparently Texas is still one of the fastest growing states within the country. I don't know anybody that's moved to Oregon either, but people talk about Portland Not always in the best ways, but I guess that is, and in the Pacific Northwest in general, I guess is one part of the country where you see people moving into. And again, so even so, if you look at the last census map or the last shift in representatives as a result of the census, these East Coast and Midwestern states have already lost people from the last time they did the census. Now, subsequent to that, they've lost even more. Look at Michigan; it's gone down from 14 to 13, and would have been 15, let's say 10 years before that. And so would have New York. New York would have had 28 then. So this continues to go on. Now, of course, what that means, though, of course, it does obviously over time lead to a sort of a shifting of political power. Now, you obviously see that many of the countries are gray, which means that their population levels are basically staying stable. But in fact, you do see significant overlap, between this map and the last one. I won't keep shifting back and forth, but I obviously I think you can see where you see these population fluctuations taking place. Okay, so then you move on to the Senate. Now, another thing to keep in mind is that until 1913, when the 17th Amendment was passed and ratified, the state legislatures basically chose the senators. People didn't not even get to vote directly for the Senate. How undemocratic is that? Again, just another example of really how undemocratic the Constitution is meant to be. Now, since 1913, the people do vote directly for their senators, although that has not significantly made the Senate a more democratic branch of government. You still have the fact that, again, states that are significantly small, I actually will go back to this map for a second, because consider this, for example, right? Many of these, I guess what they're often referred to as the mountain states, Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, the Dakotas, hardly anybody lives in those countries. You can see most of them have one or only two representatives. So they actually have less members in the House than they do senators. But collectively, right, there are 10 senators that come out of this area, an area of the country where, I'm not trying to pick on people that live in this area of the country, but there's not a lot of people. Yet they get 10 senators between these states. Look at a state like California or New York, biggest, among the biggest states in the country. New York is still obviously a very big state, even if it is losing people. You only get 2 senators from each state. So that significantly shifts the balance of power, or at least, significantly undermines the power of people that live in the more populated parts of the country. And again, I would go back to things like, why is it so hard to get bills passed? Why is it, that will actually benefit people besides just, tax cuts for the wealthy, which they never seem to have a hard time doing that? Why is it so hard to get a, a Medicare for all thing passed? Why is it so hard to get a Green New Deal thing passed? Why is it hard to raise the minimum wage? Why are all these things hard to get passed? Even though if you look at most public opinion polls, it shows pretty strong majorities of people want these things passed, including higher taxes on the wealthy. So why is it so hard to get these things passed? It's because the system is set up in a way to make it very, very difficult to get these things passed. I think that's the most charitable way you can look at Biden or Obama or anything like that, and be like, yeah, they're probably trying as hard as they can to get these things, but the system itself just makes it impossible for it. And again, not to repeat myself too much, though, the thing about that, though, is that they apparently expect us to just keep voting for them endlessly and just always trying to, cross our fingers and hope things are going to get better next time. I think the time frame that you can expect people to just sort of sit around and wait peacefully for things to improve is increasingly getting more narrow, though. I mean, things I think really need to change significantly in a fairly short period of time, if you want to avoid, major conflict within this country. And I don't, I'm not really optimistic about that, happening at all. But that is basically the situation that we have now. So again, I think that's the most charitable way you can talk about Biden. I obviously don't think the Biden administration is doing a great job. Again, maybe it's not necessarily their fault, or you should blame them entirely for it. Other things about, like the pandemic and things like that, I don't think that's even something you can necessarily blame on the Constitution necessarily. Although Republicans have also shown that they're pretty much, dead set about really spending any more money to, mitigate or contain the spread of the virus. So I guess there's that factor as well. But like I said, I mean, whether it's their fault or not, I mean, I don't see how you could just keep, expect people to just, sit around, waiting for things to get better. Anyway, so the Senate is an extremely undemocratic branch of government. Even though people now vote for it in a direct way, you also have something that's happened basically since the 1970s, where basically the vote threshold has now changed, has gotten higher, thus making it, again, harder to get things through the Senate, right? Until basically about the 1970s, most votes were decided by a simple majority, which would be 51 votes. Since the 1970s, though, it now basically, for most bills to get through the Senate, you need 60 votes now in order to prevent a filibuster. And again, that is something that we'll certainly spend more time talking about. There were instances of the filibuster, obviously, before this, particularly during the Reconstruction era, during the Civil Rights era, and various other times as well. But they were not, it was not as much of a threat as it is now, or as has become basically over the last 50 years, to the extent that now, like I said, basically they've essentially changed the rules of the Senate so that you now, in most cases, need 60 votes to get things through. There are, of course, exceptions to that. But that's something that we'll certainly, talk about more. So again, I already pretty much talked about the idea of how laws are passed. Any member of Congress, in theory, can propose a bill. Now the House, and again, I'll also talk about that more, but the House, being that it's much larger, is much more structured. There are much more rules that govern the deliberations within the House. Obviously, the Speaker of the House has a lot of power in that regard. The Senate tends to be a little more freewheeling, at least relative to the House. And that's actually part of the reason why you have a filibuster, is that you can't really set a limit for the amount of time in which a senator is allowed to speak, which gives them the freedom to speak for endless periods of time, essentially, trying to essentially stall the proceedings of the Senate, which is essentially what the filibuster is. But anyway, as I already said, before something can be signed into law, it has to go through both the House and Senate, be passed in identical form, then is turned to the president. The president can then sign it into law or veto it. This is probably, I would say, the most well-known example of what is called checks and balances, right? The idea that the different branches of government, that you have a legislative branch that makes the laws, the Congress, which still in very many ways basically sets the domestic agenda for the country. Right, as much as the power of the presidency has grown, and it has, especially in terms of foreign policy, which has become much more significant in American politics since World War II. As far as the domestic political agenda goes, to a large extent, Congress basically still has supremacy there. And as we've seen, the president cannot get much done without a supportive Congress, at least in the domestic realm. So that is still true, and that is one reason, in theory, why you would give the power to make laws to a Congress. In theory, this is supposed to prevent the abuse of power and arbitrary use of power, which are so important to the founders, we are led to believe, to prevent tyranny from taking shape in America, although also obviously, to prevent, again, a powerful majority of non-wealthy, non-property owning people from getting their way as well. But you have the legislative branch, which makes the laws. You have the executive branch, which is the presidency, which basically carries out or executes the laws. And then you have the judicial branch, which basically interprets the laws and decides where the boundaries rest for the Congress and the presidency. And of course, there's been an evolution to all these things. The powers of each of these branches of government have, of course, changed to some extent since the earliest days. But again, the idea of a presidential veto as a limit on the power of Congress is a very important example of a check and balance. The fact that the laws have to be passed by the Congress before the president can execute them is a check on the power of the president. It limits the power of the presidency, of course. Now, there is, of course, a way to override a presidential veto, but it's hard. You basically need a 2/3 majority in both the House and Senate to be able to do that, which would be a lot of people. They're hard, obviously. There have been examples of that happening, but it's pretty rare for the most part. So now we'll deal with the executive branch, and we'll talk a little bit about that also, about how the veto works and overriding a presidential veto works. But let me get now into the executive branch of government. So the second article of the Constitution covers the executive branch. It also basically outlines what the Electoral College is, which is, again, is another very undemocratic institution within the government as well. Now, originally, the electors were chosen by the state legislatures. Again, people did not have a direct say over even electing the president of the country. Now, the way in which that system has kind of evolved is that now, for the most part, the electors respond to the popular vote within each state. It's still a very confusing system. We do not have a national popular vote, as we've seen. We all know examples of this playing out fairly recently. But what you do have basically is a state-by-state contest to choose who the president is going to be, where the people within that state have some say, at least, in choosing who the president is going to be by sort of influencing the electors of that state to cast their vote for the president. In theory, it actually really rests on fairly shaky grounds. I mean, there's no sort of explicit constitutional guarantee of that. In theory, electors could disobey the popular vote and cast their vote for who they want. And even if they do, again, the idea that you have a situation where a president can lose the popular vote and still become president of the country, I think is a very bad situation. And the reason for that is because even though people vote within their states, the system still tends to waste a lot of votes. You have a lot of excess votes, basically, that aren't counted in a national popular total, but only count within the state in which you live in. So let's say New York State, for example. So people vote for a presidential candidate in New York State. Let's assume it's the Democrats, since they usually win the state of New York. Now, you probably get a significant excess or surplus of votes cast for that Democratic president within the state of New York. Those votes get wasted because they don't, further increase the chances of that president winning the election. All you really need, essentially is one more vote than the Republican president gets to win the votes for that state. So the excess of people who vote for the Democratic candidate beyond what they need to win that state essentially don't get counted. And it really violates the principle of one person, one vote, which we at least pretend to some extent to abide by. Although that is, again, more of a norm than, again, another sort of, constitutional guarantee. Anyway, this is something else that we'll talk about more. Again, at this point, I just want to kind of give a brief overview of the different institutions. Article 2 also covers the impeachment process, or how a president can be removed from office. We've seen several recent impeachments, although yet see a president actually removed from office through the impeachment process. Whether or not Trump gets, convicted in another court is up for debate, or we'll sort of see how that plays out. But they were not able to remove Trump through the impeachment process. Now, the way in which that works is that basically the House formally lays charges against the president for high crimes and misdemeanors, again, as it says in the Constitution. And the Senate essentially becomes like a court where the president is tried. The House brings the charges and acts as prosecutor, but the Senate votes on it and acts as a jury. The House only requires a simple majority to bring charges, but the Senate requires a 2/3 majority to convict. So again, setting a very high threshold for that. Now, again, here you see an illustration of how the Electoral College works. Now, this is from one of these right-wing, media outlets that are essentially, bragging about the fact, or almost like gloating over the fact that all these states that have significantly smaller populations, play a disproportionately large influence in shaping how the presidential election works, at least to an extent. I mean, at least to the extent that you don't have just a straight national popular vote, which I think quite clearly would be the obvious solution here, or would be a better version of the system that we already have. Now, the way in which the electoral votes, I do have to go back a little bit, are allocated is also, again, tied to the congressional representation of the state. So New York, because it has 26 representatives, would actually have 28 electoral votes. So it's basically, if you want to figure out the electoral votes for a state, simply look at the number of people they have in the House and add 2 for 2 senators from each state. So California would have 54, Texas would have 40, Florida would have 30, Wyoming would have 3. So yes, many of these states do obviously have much smaller electoral votes than the more populated states. But again, since the system tends to waste so many votes, it still significantly undermines a popular majority, leading to, at least in recent memory, Presidents Trump and Bush getting elected to office, even though they lost the popular vote. So I would say that's fairly significant, especially given the way those presidencies turned out. I would argue both of them did significant damage to the country. And the fact that you allowed unpopular, undemocratic presidents to get into office that way kind of really shows you how, what a bad institution this is, basically. Unless, of course, you're a far-right fanatic, like the members of the Patriot Post, who I looked them up. They're the editors and the staff of this outlet not only give their brief biographical sketch, they also list what their favorite firearm is. So that kind of gives you a sense of where these people are coming from. They really love guns, in other words. So again, unless you're, a far right extremist like that, you're probably not that much in favor of the Electoral College. Now beyond the fact that George W. Bush lost the popular vote in 2000, it was even more suspect because it seems like he probably lost the Electoral College as well, because he probably did not win the state of Florida. Although conservatives within that state abetted by the conservative Supreme Court pretty much guaranteed Bush a victory. And this is just a little excerpt from the Supreme Court case Bush v. Gore, where, authored by Antonin Scalia, a extremely conservative former Supreme Court justice or judge, who basically lays out here that, people really don't have any real right to choose the president. And I think it's kind of, interesting what he says here. So he writes, the individual citizen has no federal constitutional right to vote for electors for the president of the United States, unless and until the state legislature chooses a statewide election as the means to implement its power to appoint members of the Electoral College. So basically, this is their rationale for saying, like, well, you know what? Who really cares? Essentially what he's saying is that, like, who cares who the people in Florida voted for? The electors, can cast their vote for whoever they want. If they want to cast their vote for George Bush, whether or not George Bush won the popular vote, even in the state of Florida, doesn't really matter. This is the source for the statement in McPherson v. Blacker that the state legislature's power to select the manner for appointing electors is plenary. If so, it may, if it's so select the electors itself, which indeed was the manner used by state legislatures in several states for many years after the framing of the Constitution. History has now favored the voter, and in each of the several states, the citizens themselves vote for presidential electors. When the state legislature vests the right to vote for president in its people, the right to vote as the legislature has prescribed is fundamental, and one source of its fundamental nature lies in the equal weight accorded to each vote and the equal dignity owed to each voter. The state, of course, after granting the franchise in the special context of Article 2, can take back the power to appoint electors. So they're saying, again, the even if states have kind of evolved the system where, we'll let the people of the state, choose who the electors vote for, we can take it back whenever we want. And that's essentially what they did in the case of Florida. I mean, it was even more complicated than that. But basically, this was their rationale for stopping a recount, which was going on in Florida. Most people now basically, I think, would argue, though I'm sure not everyone, that had the recount continued, it would have gone in favor of Gore, not Bush, and thus Gore would have won the state of Florida and would have won the Electoral College. So even with Florida in the Bush column, Bush still lost the popular vote. But what makes this election even more controversial, I would say, than the election of 2016 is that there's probably a pretty good argument that Bush probably even lost the Electoral College, but was still installed rather than elected president anyway, and basically installed by the conservative Supreme Court, several members of which, basically had, close ties to the Bush administration. I believe both Scalia and Clarence Thomas had family members working for the Bush campaign. Of course, there's all these things that come out about Clarence Thomas recently, which I won't comment on right now, at least, to suggest that their integrity and their impartiality is certainly up for question. Anyway, so keep that in mind. That the right of the people to even choose who the president is rests on very unstable ground, not a stable foundation. And then finally, we'll get to the judicial branch of government. So the third article covers the judicial branch, which includes the Supreme Court and the lesser federal courts. This link, which I won't go to right here to try to save time, but shows you basically a more detailed overview of the federal judicial branch. It is not just the Supreme Court, even though, of course, most people think of it that way. Very important thing to keep in mind here, the power of judicial review, which basically gives power to the Supreme Court to strike down laws and policies taken by the government as unconstitutional. It does not reside in the Constitution itself. There's nothing that explicitly gives the Supreme Court the power to do this. This was a power basically granted to the court itself during one of the early Supreme Court cases, Marbury v. Madison, which we'll also look at more in future classes. But again, it's important to just keep in mind here that power is not actually part of the Constitution. But it is a very important power. It is very impactful ability basically given to the Supreme Court. They have the power to do that. There is a distinction between original jurisdiction, appellate jurisdiction, which I won't really go into because those are really not that important. Suffice to say, of course, that most cases end up in the Supreme Court by appeal, right? Before something gets to the Supreme Court, it usually goes through at least 2 lower courts before it ends up in the Supreme Court. And of course, the Supreme Court has a right to say no. The Supreme Court usually gets about, gets thousands of requests to hear cases a year, but only, I think, maybe at the most, only grants about 100 requests a year. So of course, the vast majority do not get heard. And of course, the cases that get selected are the ones which they consider to be the most important, the ones which have the strongest bearing on the Constitution and the powers of the government. So that's it. I mean, most of what is in the Constitution are contained within the first 3 articles. I've already talked a little bit about other parts of it, like Article 6, which provides for assumption of the debt. Article 5, it covers the amendment process. Article 4 basically specifies a little bit more, relations between the states and federal government, although that is obviously something that has evolved as well. And then Article 7 basically deals with how the Constitution is going to be ratified. The Constitution is a very, a pretty short document for the most part. So after the convention had completed its work, copies of the Constitution were circulated throughout the states. People in the states elected delegates to serve on state conventions to ratify the Constitution. The first state to ratify was Delaware in late 1787. That's why it's often referred to as the first state. New Hampshire was the decisive ninth to ratify. So you didn't even need all 13 states to ratify it. Only 9 out of the 13 were necessary. Well, of course, all 13 states did later ratify it. The first system, the system of government on the Constitution officially went into effect March 4th, 1789, with George Washington, of course, inaugurated as president, the only president to be unanimously elected, both through basically getting all of the votes of the Electoral College. Although at that time, and this is getting at this point more into like trivia, I would say, the Electoral College was a little bit different. Electors actually chose 2 people to be president. They got to vote twice. That was later changed during an important constitutional conflict or crisis with the election of Thomas Jefferson, that they would then vote for a defined president, vice presidential ticket. Anyway, so then you deal with the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution ratified in 1791. So again, not originally part of the Constitution, but pretty soon followed after. And in fact, I mean, almost immediately, there was an intent to get the Bill of Rights added to it. It just took time for the process to work itself through. We'll talk about that more maybe in future classes. You also have the Reconstruction Amendments. I mean, I'm assuming, of course, that everyone has read these things, so we'll certainly emphasize some of the more important amendments. Probably the most important of the 14th Amendment of the Reconstruction Amendments is the 14th Amendment, which we'll talk about more when we talk about the Supreme Court. It is the amendment that is cited most often by the Supreme Court. Then you have some of the progressive amendments, and they tend to not get as much attention as some of the other amendments, although I think they're very important. I've already talked about the 17th Amendment, giving power to elect senators directly. You also have the 18th Amendment, the infamous Prohibition Amendment, and then you also have the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote in 1920. You also have the 16th Amendment, which established an income tax within the country. Now, why is the income tax an amendment? And what is the income tax? Basically, it is a tax on incomes. It is a progressive tax where the more income you make, the higher a percentage of your income you pay to the federal government. Not just in dollar terms, but as a percentage of your income as well. Now, the reason why it had to become a constitutional amendment was because there were earlier attempts to pass an income tax, which was struck down, again, by the Supreme Court as being unconstitutional. In 1894, Democrats passed the first income tax. It was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. Opponents called it socialism, communism, devilism, according to Senator John Sherman. Joseph Choate, dean of the New York Bar, referred to as a communist march on private property. According to Justice Stephen J. Field, who ruled in this case, called it an assault upon capital and a war of the poor against the rich. Field also took part in the 1886 decision to rewrite the 14th Amendment to mean that corporations were people and entitled to immunities and privileges. What a great guy. So why are these people so incensed and outraged about the income tax? Why they equate it with communism? It seems a bit of a strong statement. Well, the idea, as I already said, basically is there is a redistributive aspect of it. The income tax is not just a means of raising revenue, which actually the primary way for the government to raise revenue at this time was actually through the tariff, a tax essentially on imports coming into the country. The income tax was proposed in part maybe to replace the tariff to a certain extent, but also it was a tool basically to redistribute income and to create a greater level of income inequality within the country. So in a sense, it's not that crazy of a thing to at least associate it to some extent with socialism. It's still a bit of a far cry from full-blown socialism, obviously, but there is certainly an element to it that is like that. Now, the United States, for all the crying that you basically hear people in this country, particularly wealthy people, talk about taxes, the United States has a pretty low tax rate compared to most other countries. Now, what you see here is the marginal tax rate for highest and lowest wage earners. So low wage earners have, they're obviously the amount of tax that they pay is much lower than the highest earners. The highest income tax bracket has fluctuated at various points. At one point being, about 90% after World War II, although everyone says that nobody actually paid that amount. But even at other periods of time, still significantly high, as much as 60, 70% tax rate on the highest income earners. Now, as you can see now, it's pretty low by historical standards, less than 40%. Now, what's interesting about this is that it correlates very well with the level of income inequality within this country, suggesting that as income tax rates go up and down, that it also tracks very strongly with the level of income inequality within the country. In other words, the higher the tax rate on high income earners, the more equal society generally tends to be in terms of income inequality. Now, there are other taxes to consider as well. You have a capital gains tax, which has also been cut. Capital gains is basically profits from the sale of assets like stocks and real estate, often been subject to lower tax rates than ordinary income. Well, why should that be the case? This means that wealthy individuals who are more likely to derive a significant portion of their income from investments pay a lower tax rate on a substantial part of their earnings. You also have the estate tax, often referred to by right-wingers as the death tax, a tax levied on large estates passed on to heirs. Over the years, there have been efforts to reduce or eliminate the estate tax, allowing wealthy families to pass on substantial wealth to future generations with minimal taxation. This perpetuates wealth concentration within wealthy families. You also have corporate tax cuts, not taxes on your income, but on corporate revenues, basically. Lowering corporate tax rates benefits businesses and their shareholders, which are, of course, often the wealthy. However, the extent to which corporate tax cuts benefits workers and stimulate broader economic growth is a subject of debate, which is a nice way of saying that lower taxes on corporations has not done much to stimulate economic growth within this country. So again, look at this here. Well, so keep in mind there are other taxes that play a role, but look at the income tax bracket and then look at the level of inequality within society. Now, I showed a different version of this graph in a previous class. You can see that when income taxes were higher, there was income inequality was actually pretty high during the early part of the 20th century, probably because a lot of people didn't actually pay the tax or found loopholes. But you see, like mid-century, high income tax, lower level of wealth inequality, low income tax, higher level of wealth inequality. I'm sorry, I had to skip, two slides instead of just one, but hopefully that's still easy enough to follow along. So there's definitely a strong correlation between those things. And in fact, many people would go further and say that not just a correlation, but a causality, that higher or lower tax rates, in fact, causes the level of wealth, of income inequality to rise or fall. Other factors matter as well, but that is, of course, one of the most important factors. Now, keep in mind, and I think I've already pointed this out, but I'll say it again, income inequality is not the same thing as wealth inequality. Wealth is a more broader concept, right? And and in fact, now that I'm saying this out loud, I know that I said this in previous class, but income is broader than just income. Wealth is just broader than just income. Income is basically, how much you make from your job, the kind of salary that you get, or the kind of wage that you earn. But wealth includes, ownership of stocks and bonds and real estate and things like that. So as bad as the level of income inequality is in the country, and again, the higher this line goes, the more income is concentrated among the top 10% of income earners, wealth inequality has an even greater disparity. There's even a greater concentration of wealth at the very top than there is income. And I also mentioned, although I don't have the graph here, the significant racial impact to this as well. The wealth and income gap between white households and black households is significantly greater as well. I don't have that slide here, but I know I did include it in a previous class lecture. Again, here's basically just another way of sort of looking at a lot of what I just said, but if you want a different demonstration of this, again, the top 1% and the top 0.01% have really, I mean, this is a little bit better because this only shows you the top 10%. This breaks it down even more. And you can see that the top of the top, not even the top 10%, not even just the top 1%, but the top 1/10 of 1% basically have seen the greatest rise in their incomes. I keep that in mind. I mentioned strikes a moment ago. In fact, I was just having a conversation about this not too long ago, about the UPS workers going on strike. Well, it's like, how much do UPS truck drivers make? About 55, 60,000 a year. In other words, basically about an average income, not significantly high or low by average income standards within the United States. How much does the CEO of UPS make? Oh, about $19 million a year. And that's actually gone down from previous years, by the way. So significant wealth and income inequality within this country has, again, as you can see, become much more significant, only in the last 40 years or so. I say only because, in historical terms, that's not a huge amount of time. But it is fairly significant. Now, listen, I mean, these are all, and any of the data here can be questioned and criticized, and that's all fair game. One of the more interesting objections I've heard to this, besides the fact that it only looks at income inequality, not wealth inequality, is that some people would argue that even mid-century, actually things were much more unequal even back then. This actually gives you sort of a false impression of relative equality that existed back then. So maybe that is true. If that was true, then it would mean that the magnitude of inequality has not grown as much since the 1970s, but only because you're starting from a place where the level of inequality was already greater to begin with. So in other words, almost any way you look at it, I don't know anyone that can really credibly deny the fact that income and wealth inequality, because you always have to emphasize that part as well, has grown significantly worse within this country. Now, some people try to dismiss that or to try to trivialize it. Well, okay, so some people are getting very rich, but everyone's kind of benefiting in some ways. Well, are they really? I mean, have their incomes kept up with the massive rise in the cost of living, say for buying a house or something like that? The answer is no, they haven't. I mean, the price of housing has increased by over 1,000% since the 1970s. Incomes have not gone up nearly that much. Wages have not gone up nearly that much. So this idea that, well, everyone's doing a little bit better, but some people are doing a lot better is not really true. Some people are doing a lot better, and other people are just floundering and actually have seen their living standards go down because, again, how much you get paid. And this is a common fallacy here within the United States. This is why I guess I'm laying emphasis on it. Because, yeah, if you look at income statistics within the United States compared to other countries, on paper, it looks like Americans make higher incomes. But do they actually get to spend that money on themselves? No, not for the most part, right? Most of that money, most people basically live paycheck to paycheck, a phrase which is very familiar, I think, to most people. Most Americans have very little discretionary income. Most Americans have very low savings because whatever money they may be getting paid more money, but they also live in a society where everything is extremely high cost. Housing is expensive, healthcare is expensive, education is expensive, everything is expensive. And now because of inflation, things are getting even more expensive. So even though Americans on paper may seem like they have higher incomes, some do, as I said, there's a significant income gap between, whites and blacks within this country as well as other so-called minority groups. Even people who look like they make fairly high incomes actually are not. And for people who even on paper look like they're making low incomes, you can imagine how much worse that actually is for them when you then factor into the enormous costs of living, right? According to the sociologist Matthew Desmond, rents, for example, in lower income neighborhoods are not significantly less than rents in higher income neighborhoods, meaning people that have a lot less money, a lot less income, are paying almost the same amount of rents, the same amount in rent as people who live in much higher income areas. So, even if you don't have a lot of money, you're still basically subject to the very high cost economy. I'm just saying that because that's if you ever hear somebody say that, yeah, these people are making a lot more, but everyone's doing better off in some way. That gives you the right to kind of call bullshit on that, because no, actually they aren't. When you factor into the cost of living and things like that, people's living standards are actually basically going down. So keep that in mind. Besides that, high income and wealth inequality also contributes to things like, again, as you can see, people have no money in savings, debts are extremely high. Well, that's what you would expect, of course, when you're not making any money and the cost of everything else is going up. But beyond that, it also contributes to very slow economic growth within the country. That is a high level of inequality. If you look at the growth of the U.S. economy in the 1950s and 60s, it grew on average about 4% every year. That means some years a little bit higher, some years a little bit lower, but basically averaging out to about 4% over the course of 2 decades. Over the course of the last decade, the decade since the Great Crash, it's a little bit more than a decade now. But since the economic crash of 2008, the economy's grown by less than 2% on average, less than half as fast as it was growing within the 1950s and 60s. And again, a lot of that can be attributed to high levels of inequality within the country. Now, why is economic growth important? Well, for lots of reasons. I mean, it's generally considered one of the most basic measures of the health of an economy. But beyond that, as long as the population keeps growing, you have to have the economy grow as well. I mean, this is a controversial idea. Even on the left, there are a lot of people on the left who are in favor of no growth or zero growth economies. I mean, that's an interesting debate, and it's not something I know. Feel like I necessarily have the last word on this issue, but at least to my understanding of it, again, as long as you have a growing population, you kind of need to have economic growth as well. And by that standard, then, the American economy is not doing very well. It's growing actually very slowly. It's doing a little bit better than the other economies like the United Kingdom and France, countries which I've already, mentioned have had, significant protests going on with them as well. Much like the United States, which has a very sort of growing fascist movement within the country, represented by Donald Trump, but also people like DeSantis and all these other people, if I can use that term loosely, that gravitate around the Republican Party these days. You also have growing fascist movements again throughout Europe as well, especially in countries that have had a prior history of fascism: Spain, Portugal, Italy, Germany. You have very strong fascist movements developing there. In France, the far right continues to be a significant threat. So, I mean, this again goes back to this idea of like when people say Biden is doing a great job. Well, if Biden is doing a great job, then why is fascism growing? Why is fascism a rising movement within this country, and not just within this country, but within the other advanced capitalist democracies as well? That seems to undermine that claim. Anyway, so yes, so high levels of inequality, slow economic growth, slow productivity growth, and an important aspect of economic growth, how much output is being produced by the workforce. Other things that relate to this: less investment within the economy, declining human capital, less investment going towards health and education and things that would actually improve the living standards of people within this country. Financial instability. More and more of the, a big portion of the economy is dependent on finance, insurance, and real estate, also known as the FIRE economy, which tends to be prone to high levels of financial speculation, which leads to bubbles, which lead to then, crashes like we've seen in 2008. A low level, although other factors play into the crash as well, like declining investment levels, which usually gets overlooked. You also have a very low level of social mobility within this country, people rising from poor to middle class or high income status. We like to tell ourselves that this is the land of opportunity and all that stuff. You know, when you look at the actual statistics on this, U.S. doesn't do particularly well in that area. Most people, you know, if you're born poor in this country, you have a very high chance of, like, you know, going through your life being poor. In fact, much more so than in many other countries where you do have more of a sort of, you know, redistribution of income and greater, you know, spending on social welfare and things like that. All right. So then once the Constitution is ratified, so again, that was my long-winded response to why the income tax is actually an important thing. It is very much important, you know, related to the level of inequality that you see within society. I'd now like to turn a little bit to talking about the Federalist Papers, which I signed along with the Constitution and the Declaration. Let's just get right into talking about Federalist 10, which I think is arguably the most important essay within the Federalist Papers, or Federalist Papers sometimes referred to as just the Federalist. The Federalist Papers were basically essays written in New York newspapers, basically urging people to ratify the Constitution. They have since obviously been collected as a series of essays. Again, they're usually referred to either as the Federalist or the Federalist Papers. I tend to use both terms. Federalist number 10, for example, is important because it lays out the theoretical framework for the current system of governments. In other words, why do we have this government in the first place? Madison makes it clear that the purposes of the federal government, the union or the union of states, is beneficial because it will best control the effects of factions, what he calls the disease of all popular governments. Today, you know, you could call them special interests, I guess. Although I think maybe going, you know, or lobbyists, but I mean, going beyond that as well, of course. But sort of, you know, very animated groups of people who have what he considers to be their own, you know, interests that are harmful to the public well-being. I'll skip over this part about pluralists, but we can maybe talk about that at a later point. Anyway, I want to read out a couple of passages from Federalist 10. So here's an important one where Madison talks about trying to control the effects of factions rather than the causes of factions. Factions may be the disease of popular government, so he says, but you can't really do much to deal with the causes of it, because he says that the causes of factions basically are essentially a byproduct of liberty. As long as you live in a free society where people are allowed to express their opinions and allowed to organize and allowed to, you know, pursue their interests, that you will have factions. So he says there are two methods of curing the mischiefs of faction. The one by removing its causes, the other by controlling its effects. There are again two methods of removing the causes of faction. The one by destroying the liberty which is essential to its existence, the other by giving to every citizen the same opinions, the same passions, and the same interests. It could never be more truly said than of the first remedy that it was worse than the disease. Liberty is to faction what air is to fire, an ailment without which it instantly expires. It's a very famous phrase, and I've already seen some people reference it in their own writings. But it could not be less folly to abolish liberty, which is essential to political life because it nourishes faction, than it would be to wish the annihilation of air, which is essential to animal life because it imparts to fire its destructive agency. Very interesting metaphor he uses. And this is probably the most famous part of it. But I like the next passage better because it's very revealing. And again, I think speaks a lot to Beard's argument about the economic interest of the founders playing a very important role, obviously, in shaping the Constitution. It speaks a lot to Marx's argument about the centrality of class struggle as an animating feature of social and political life. This is essentially a statement that places the idea of, you know, what is sometimes referred to as class conflict or class struggle at the center of political conflict. Though this is written several decades, in fact, before Karl Marx is even born. So you can't necessarily say that Marx sort of invented the idea class struggle. In fact, you see it throughout political philosophy, even going back to the ancient Greeks, Plato and Aristotle, for example. Anyway, Madison, it's believed to be Madison. These essays were published under pseudonyms or under a pseudonym, Publius. I think at this point, authorship of them is pretty much well known. I think there's maybe some dispute over some of them, but I think it's generally accepted that Madison wrote Federalist 10. He writes, the latent causes of faction are thus sown in the nature of man, and we see them everywhere brought into different degrees of activity according to the different circumstances of civil society. So strong is this propensity of mankind to fall into mutual animosities that where no substantial occasion presents itself, the most frivolous and fanciful distinctions have been sufficient to kindle their unfriendly passions and excite their most violent conflicts. But the most common and durable source of factions has been the various and unequal distribution of property. So he's saying property conflicts over who owns and who doesn't own property, or wealth, in other words, or the means of production, as Marx would say, is the central focus of political conflict. Those who hold and those who are without property have ever formed distinct interests in society. Those who are creditors and those who are debtors. In other words, a reference probably to Shays' rebellion, which was, of course, motivated by debt, the debts that these farmers were finding themselves in, fall under a like discrimination. Creditors are basically bankers, or people who own the people who own the debts. A landed interest, a manufacturing interest, a mercantile interest, a moneyed interest, with many lesser interests, grow up of necessity in civilized nations and divide them into different classes. He even used the term classes, actuated by different sentiments and views. The regulation of these various and interfering interests forms the principal task of modern legislation and involves the spirit of party and faction in the necessary and ordinary operations of the government. Again, in some ways, a very kind of almost Marxist thing to say. We're very much, not all that different of what Aristotle would have said about democracies and oligarchies, which I've also talked about. Now, of course, the key difference here between Marx and Madison, and even from Marx and Aristotle, well, I'll leave Aristotle out for the most part. I think Madison's views are clearly influenced by Aristotle to a large extent. But the crucial difference between Madison and Marx here is that, of course, Madison is trying to contain class conflict or class struggle. He's trying to keep it within sort of acceptable boundaries, which he believes that you can do through the constitutional system of government that they have proposed here. The Marxist response, simply put, is that you can't. You cannot contain class conflict. That eventually the antagonisms between different economic classes or social classes within society will eventually become so intense that they'll sort of break through any political boundaries or political checks and balances that you try to subject them to. That, I would argue, is probably the crucial difference, at least here, at least regarding this idea between Marx and Madison. Now, who's right? That's a big question. I'm sure most people would like to think that Madison is correct, that you can't really ever get rid of class conflict. So you have to just try to contain it. But what if Marx is right? What if you can't contain it? Not forever, at least. Marx, of course, does offer the idea, at least, that there is a sort of a way out of this, but the way out of that is basically through socialism. And I'll sort of, leave it up to people to decide who is right. I would, only add that, when you look at everything with inequality within this country, within the political polarization and political conflict that is developing within the society, the growth of fascist movements, those are reasons, I think, to be very much, concerned with what Madison is saying. And I think I'll pretty much end things here. Yeah, here's even a letter from Marx to Wedemeyer, who's actually a socialist living in the United States. where Marx feels that his idea of what he calls the dictatorship of the proletariat is one of his own sort of original contributions. That the only way in which you can have socialism is to, essentially have the working class basically seize political power for itself. And you could argue again that the Constitution is basically set up in a way to make sure that you would never have something like that you would never have a dictatorship of the proletariat within the proletariat being Marx's term, of course, for the working class, the industrial working class. And if that is the objective of the Constitution, to prevent the dictatorship of the proletariat, then it's worked exceedingly well in that regard. Whether or not it's sufficient to contain class conflict or class struggle is something definitely up for debate, especially in the era that we live in now. Anyway, so I think I'll end things here. I didn't get really a chance to talk about the New York Times article. I guess I'll save that for next class. I think I've talked enough already, so I will leave things here. Okay, so take care, everyone.